For a long time in the 20th century, the topic of life after death remained on the fringe of science. It was the domain of religion, philosophy, and mysticism. But in 1957, a Canadian psychiatrist, a graduate of McGill University, and a researcher at the University of Virginia decided to break that institutional silence. His name was Dr. Ian Stevenson. What set him apart from so many others who ventured into the same territory was his method. Stevenson did not try to prove beliefs. He sought to test hypotheses, applying the same rigor a biologist would use to study a genetic mutation. When he took over the chair of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, he began collecting accounts from children who claimed to remember previous lives. To most scientists, these were mere fantasies, products of childish imagination. Stevenson, however, noticed a pattern. In hundreds of cases, the children described verifiable places, names, and historical details, many of which were later confirmed in public records. This led him to a simple yet revolutionary question. Could human consciousness survive biological death? In the 1960s, Stevenson traveled through countries where the belief in reincarnation was culturally accepted: India, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Thailand. In every documented case, he applied forensic-level stringency: cross-interviews, photographs, legal documentation, and verification of dates and witnesses. The result was a collection of over 2,000 cases, archived and analyzed according to scientific criteria. No other researcher in history has accumulated comparable empirical material on this topic. His conclusions were always cautious. He never claimed to prove reincarnation. He preferred to state that certain cases suggest the survival of a personality after death. Nonetheless, his works, especially 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, 1966, put the subject on the table for academic discussion. For the first time, the debate about the continuity of consciousness took a scientific form, supported by data, not by faith. The reaction from the scientific community, however, was mixed. Many respected his rigor, but avoided associating themselves with a topic that seemed to threaten the dominant materialism. Stevenson remained unshaken, reiterating that science should investigate all observable phenomena, even those that challenge our assumptions. For him, it was just as unscientific to reject reincarnation without examining the evidence as it was to accept it without question. At the heart of this journey was a personal conviction: consciousness is nature's greatest mystery. And if it can exist independently of the body, then the concept of death, as defined by biology, might just be a change of state, not an end. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Dr. Ian Stevenson solidified a body of work that challenged the prevailing paradigm of medical science. While neurology deepened its understanding of the brain as the center of mental functions, Stevenson questioned whether the mind might be a mere byproduct of the brain, or if, conversely, the brain was merely a transmitter of consciousness. This shift in perspective became a focal point in his publications, sparking intense debates among psychologists, philosophers, and physicists. At conferences at the University of Virginia, Stevenson often presented what he called memory traces, recollections, personality traits, and even unexplained phobias in very young children that they could not have acquired through normal means. He described, with clinical precision, cases where this content appeared to correspond to events from another life. For him, the critical question wasn't whether one believed in reincarnation, but whether the observable data was consistent with that hypothesis. This stance made him simultaneously admired and criticized, a persistent scientist who rejected both automatic skepticism and naive belief. Stevenson relied on the principles of empirical research. Every case required detailed documentation, witness names, civil registry records, and physical and psychological descriptions. Whenever possible, he compared birthmarks or scars on children with records of injuries or causes of death of deceased individuals. It was a search for what he called verifiable bridges between two existences. This novel methodology sought to bring reincarnation into the realm of observation and systematic analysis, removing it from the domain of the supernatural. Despite the rigor, the academic environment reacted cautiously. Many colleagues felt that the survival of consciousness after death lay outside the boundaries of empirical science. Stevenson, however, insisted that science should be defined not by what it accepts, but by what it is willing to investigate. He stated in interviews that ignoring anomalous phenomena out of philosophical discomfort was a form of dogmatism, and that the true scientific spirit required curiosity in the face of the unknown. In Germany, where interest in the philosophy of mind has always been strong, his books began circulating in translation from the 1970s onwards. European researchers, accustomed to the tradition of Kant and Goethe, found in Stevenson a bridge between empiricism and metaphysics. He did not establish dogmas, he merely presented facts that seemed to point to something beyond materialism. German scientific journals, like the Zeitschrift for Parapsychology, published reviews that highlighted the methodological rigor of his approach, even among critics. By the end of that decade, Ian Stevenson had become a solitary but respected figure. He sought neither fame nor followers. His motivation was purely scientific, to understand the nature of human consciousness. In his own words, "If something survives death, biology is not enough to explain it, but observation is still our best path." For him, the study of consciousness was the meeting point between science and eternity. In the 1980s, Ian Stevenson's work was globally recognized, albeit controversial. He didn't try to convince, he sought to record, verify, and preserve evidence. His office in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia became a unique archive, hundreds of files categorized by country, date, language, and evidence type, containing transcriptions, photographs, and certified statements. Stevenson treated these documents with the same care a historian dedicates to ancient manuscripts. His obsession with precision set him apart from spiritualism enthusiasts and, paradoxically, brought him closer to the skeptics. During this phase, he published articles in academic journals and gave lectures at universities across the United States, Canada, the UK, and Germany. In his talks, he rarely spoke directly of reincarnation. He favored terms like memory transfer or continuity of personality, which carried fewer religious connotations. This choice of words was not just strategic, it was an attempt to bridge human experience and scientific observation. Stevenson believed that the scientific vocabulary should evolve to describe phenomena we do not yet fully understand. The greater challenge, however, came from the scientific system itself. The idea that consciousness could survive death threatened the philosophical foundations of materialism upon which modern medicine was built. Stevenson knew this, but saw no contradiction. "Science is not a belief in materialism. It is a method of inquiry," he wrote in one of his essays. For him, intellectual honesty demanded following the evidence, even if it led to uncomfortable conclusions. In West Germany, where phenomenological psychology and existential philosophy still held strong sway, his ideas found fertile ground. Research groups began discussing the possibility of the mind as a field independent of matter, a theme that echoed the reflections of philosophers like Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. Stevenson, though not a philosopher, inadvertently became a reference in debates about identity and the continuity of being. For some German scholars, he represented the type of scientist capable of opening a new interdisciplinary field of research where physics, psychology, and metaphysics could dialogue. Public opinion, meanwhile, reacted in strange ways. For many, Dr. Stevenson embodied the scientist of the soul. For others, he was just an eccentric psychiatrist with a well-stocked archive of coincidences. He accepted both perceptions with equanimity. In interviews, he reiterated that skepticism was essential, but that Productive skepticism is that which investigates, not that which dismisses. Over time, his collection surpassed 2,000 investigations, and the Institute of Perceptual Sciences at the University of Virginia became recognized as the world's most authoritative center for studies on consciousness and reincarnation. Stevenson's dedication proved that it is possible to apply the scientific method even to what seems, at first glance, unattainable. For many contemporary researchers, he represented something rare: the courage to think beyond the limits set by his own time. As the 1990s approached, Dr. Ian Stevenson began publishing works that unified psychology, genetics, and parapsychology under a common focus: the hypothesis that consciousness carries information that can physically manifest. He wasn't proposing a new religion, but a new model of biology, one that included the possibility that memories and psychological traits could be transferred without DNA, perhaps through some kind of field or structure not yet understood. It was a bold idea, yet one built on decades of empirical observation. In this phase, Stevenson focused on physical evidence linked to past life memories, birthmarks, deformities, and specific phobias that seemed to correspond to the injuries or circumstances of death of identifiable people. In his book, Reincarnation and Biology: A Contribution to the Etiology of Birthmarks and Birth Defects, 1997, he amassed over 2,000 pages of documentation. The material was impressive for its methodological density. Each case was accompanied by medical reports, photographic records, and anatomical comparisons. For Stevenson, these physical signs could represent the biological translation of a psychic memory, a physical echo of a previous experience. In Berlin and Munich, the work was debated in psychosomatic seminars. German researchers acknowledged that Stevenson, even without a complete theoretical model, offered something valuable: verifiable data about the mind's influence on the body. The notion that emotional experiences could shape individual biology, previously limited to psychoanalysis, gained a new dimension when linked to the reincarnation hypothesis. Even if many disagreed with the conclusions, few could ignore the consistency of the records. What made Stevenson unique was his balance between scientific caution and intellectual openness. He never claimed to have proof of reincarnation, but he firmly asserted that the cases studied are better explained by the hypothesis of the survival of consciousness than by any other known alternative explanation. This phrase, repeated at conferences, became a kind of synthesis of his thought. It's not about believing, but about recognizing what the evidence suggests. At this time, Stevenson began collaborating with neuroscientists interested in understanding the relationship between memory, identity, and physical substrate. Although the brain was widely regarded as the repository of the mind, he argued that, in certain cases, memory seemed to transcend biological limits. His perspective aligned with emerging currents in quantum physics, which were beginning to explore concepts of non-local information and universal interconnectedness, even though he avoided extrapolating into speculative theories. By the late 1990s, in his 70s, Stevenson was still personally reviewing his archives, noting corrections in translations and adding methodological annotations. When asked what motivated him to continue, he replied, "Death is the only event we all share, yet it is also the least understood. Therefore, studying survival is studying human nature itself." Thus, the Canadian doctor turned the investigation of death into a profound study of life and of the invisible continuity that perhaps connects them. In the final years of his career, Dr. Ian Stevenson faced perhaps his most complex challenge: intellectual isolation. Although his work was recognized for its integrity and method, the scientific community remained reluctant to admit the possibility of the survival of consciousness. The barrier was not just empirical, it was philosophical. Since the 19th century, the dominant paradigm in modern science rested on the idea that the mind is a product of the brain, an emergent function of matter. To admit the opposite would have required rewriting the foundation of biology and psychology. Stevenson knew this and addressed the subject with sobriety precisely because of it. He understood that science is as much a cultural construction as it is a methodology. In a 2002 interview, he said, "Ideas take a long time to change, not because evidence is lacking, but because institutions are made by people, and people fear losing the ground of their certainties." This clarity allowed him to respond to critics patiently, but also gave him an almost philosophical tone. For him, the study of reincarnation was more than an investigation of anomalous memories. It was an examination of the epistemological limit of science itself. In Germany, universities like Freiburg and Heidelberg began discussing his works in interdisciplinary seminars on consciousness. Some neuroscientists found his research relevant to understanding the early formation of childhood identity, while philosophers saw it as a pioneering attempt to integrate empiricism and metaphysics. Stevenson became an involuntary link between disciplines that rarely dialogued. His name appeared at conferences on transpersonal psychology and mind studies, alongside thinkers like Stanislav Grof and Rupert Sheldrake, even as he maintained distance from any mystical approach. Still, resistance remained. Traditional scientific journals rarely accepted his articles, arguing that the subject lacked an adequate theoretical framework. Stevenson retorted, however, that the absence of theory does not invalidate the observation of facts. On the contrary, it should encourage it. In his words, "It is the data that generates the hypothesis, not the hypothesis that creates the data." This pragmatic attitude, inherited from classical empiricism, made him a paradoxical figure, a profoundly rational man investigating a phenomenon considered irrational. During a visit to Europe in 1998, Stevenson was received by comparative psychology research groups and discussed the boundaries of the scientific method applied to consciousness with sobriety. Accounts from attendees describe a calm man, with a restrained voice, who avoided any messianic tone. A German professor who attended his lecture in Munich later wrote, "He spoke like a doctor, not a believer." He seemed to weigh every word, as if measuring the gravity of crossing the boundary between the visible and the invisible. By this time, the Institute of Perceptual Sciences, which he founded in 1967, had already trained new researchers who continued his line of work, expanding case collection and seeking theoretical models compatible with modern physics. Stevenson, however, remained out of the spotlight. "Truth needs no defenders," he said. "It only needs honest observers." And with this serenity, he concluded the 20th century, leaving a legacy that, though ignored by many, began to establish itself as fundamental to a new understanding of mind and death. With the dawn of the new millennium, Ian Stevenson was already a nearly legendary figure in the field of consciousness research. In the eyes of many, he had walked a solitary path, sustained only by the power of method and intellectual integrity. In 2002, he officially retired from the University of Virginia, but continued to oversee research at the Institute of Perceptual Sciences, the center he founded 3 decades earlier. There, young doctors and psychologists, inspired by his rigor, continued to catalog and verify cases using the same standards he had set. Stevenson knew his time was running out, but he also knew he had created something lasting: a scientific tradition of investigating the survival of consciousness. During these final years of activity, he focused less on accumulating new cases and more on reflecting on what the evidence meant for science and the philosophy of mind. In his late writings, the tone became almost meditative, albeit always data-driven. Stevenson questioned whether the resistance to the idea of reincarnation was truly scientific or merely cultural. He noted that in Asian countries, the hypothesis of the continuity of consciousness was treated with naturalness, not as a belief, but as part of the collective human experience. In the West, however, shaped by centuries of materialism and institutional theology, the topic remained a taboo. For him, This difference showed that science is also influenced by historical and mental contexts. In 2005, his health began to decline, but global interest in his work grew. Documentaries, theses, and academic articles began to view his work with a new lens. Some European neuroscientists, particularly in Germany and Switzerland, began discussing the concept of extracerebral memory, inspired by his observations. Although the term was still controversial, it opened a door to a new theoretical frontier. Perhaps the mind is not a product, but a field, something that interacts with the body, but does not extinguish with it. Stevenson followed these debates cautiously. He did not seek to be a pioneer of a new physics or a new religion, but merely to keep scientific curiosity alive regarding the phenomenon of consciousness. In one of his last lectures delivered in 2006, he stated, "Reincarnation is just one of the possible forms of continuity. If consciousness is information, it is not lost. Perhaps what we call death is just a redirection of that information." This simple and serene sentence summarized a half-century of research. For him, the idea of immortality was not a spiritual dogma, but an observable hypothesis. Death, in his view, did not end the human being. It only transformed the way consciousness manifests. In 2007, Ian Stevenson passed away at the age of 88, leaving behind a collection of over 3,000 cases and 300 scientific publications. His death was reported discreetly in newspapers across the US and Europe. In Berlin, a small memorial conference gathered researchers from various fields, and one of them summarized his importance in a single sentence. He did not prove that life after death exists, but he showed that science has a duty to investigate it. With his departure, a belief did not end. Rather, a methodology was solidified, that of looking at the invisible with the same seriousness one looks at the tangible. Today, nearly 2 decades after his death, the name Ian Stevenson is still mentioned with respect and caution in scientific circles. His work remains a boundary between the known and the unexplored, an invitation to the humility of reason in the face of the mysteries of consciousness. In Charlottesville, at the University of Virginia, the Institute of Perceptual Sciences remains active, led by researchers who have continued his line of work, including Jim B. Tucker, who has expanded the studies of childhood cases with the same forensic precision as his mentor. With every new generation of researchers, the same dilemma returns. To what extent is the mind dependent on the brain? In Germany, his legacy has found fertile ground. Since the early 2010s, universities and independent research centers have promoted symposia on consciousness and identity, exploring themes Stevenson anticipated. Contemporary philosophers cite him as one of the rare examples of empiricism applied to metaphysics. The debate on reincarnation, once marginal, shifted into broader discussions about quantum information, non-local consciousness, and neuroplasticity. Even among skeptics, there is a consensus. He set a standard of rigor that prevents the simple dismissal of the phenomenon. Stevenson's influence also manifests outside the academy. In documentaries, podcasts, and scientific TV series, his career is recounted as that of a man who challenged the dogma of materialism without straying from logic. Instead of sermons of belief, he left behind statistics, files, and verifiable testimonies, an architecture of data that resists the passage of time. His work teaches that true scientific courage lies not in defending certainties, but in enduring the discomfort of prolonged doubt. On a philosophical level, his work reopens questions that contemporary science is beginning to reevaluate. What is consciousness? Where does it begin, and where does it end? If information is not destroyed, as modern physics suggests, would it then be plausible that subjective experience also has continuity beyond the physical body? Stevenson did not live long enough to see these questions gain traction in cognitive sciences, but he paved the way for them to be formulated with seriousness. His legacy also provokes an ethical reflection. If life does not end with death, then our actions have continuity at a deeper level than the biological. This notion, without resorting to religion, suggests a connection between all forms of existence. For many of his German readers, this is perhaps Stevenson's most enduring contribution, the reintegration of moral sense into scientific discourse. In the end, what remains is a lesson in method and courage. Stevenson demonstrated that science can be both empirical and spiritual without losing its integrity. His career is a reminder that the true spirit of inquiry does not settle for established boundaries. Today, looking at the vastness of his archives, one recognizes something that transcends the sum of the evidence, an honest attempt to understand the destiny of human consciousness. And, in a way, Stevenson himself seems to have achieved what he sought: continuity. Not just in the lives he studied, but in the lasting impact of his thought, which continues to inspire scientists and philosophers not to fear humanity's oldest question. Is life after death real, or have we only just begun to understand it?